Well, our next panel is going back to Apollo, and I think we're fortunate to have a number of individuals here this morning that were involved in the Apollo programs. All the way from a flight surgeon to one of the astronauts that flew, to individuals involved in recovery and also in engineering and also the simulation and training. And our moderator this morning is Milt Heflin. Milt came to NASA and went to work in landing and recovery during Apollo, and was on a recovery ship for the recovery and post-landing activities for Apollo 8, Apollo 10, Apollo 16, Apollo 17, and all the 3 Skylab flights, as well as Apollo Soyuz. Then he became a flight controller and subsequently was a flight director and was the lead flight director on the Hubble repair mission. After that, became the head of the flight director's office, and when he retired from NASA, was the associate director of the Johnson Space Center for Technical. He's become an author, and he co-authored a book, Go Flight, The Unsung Heroes of Mission Control from 1965 to 1992, Outward Odyssey, A People's History of Spaceflight. And over and above that, he also plays the trombone in a Glenn Miller type band, and it's available for engagements throughout the Houston area. So let me turn it over to you, Milt.
George, thank you. I would have needed notes to have gone through what you went through talking about what I have done. You did that without any notes at all, so you haven't lost a thing, sir. Nothing at all. Well, good morning. Since it's kind of warm in here, I'm going to probably take this jacket off shortly, but I want to help another gentleman here get cooler too. So I'm going to introduce him first at the very end of the table. Chet Vaughn, would you stand up and strip, please? I know that it takes a team to win. And Houston has a team, and it's a winner. And I will tell you guys that we had an outstanding team leading the Apollo program, starting with Dr. Guruf, Max Vijay, Chris Kraft, and many, many others. And we're here representing some of those guys as well, but it's a pleasure to be here. And I won't talk anymore right now. So, if you want to, are you just going to keep that on, right? You don't keep your shirt on there? No, I'm going to take the shirt off. Well, go ahead and take the shirt off. Yeah. This is Chet Vaughn, ladies and gentlemen. He graduated from Virginia Tech in 1959 with a BS in mechanical engineering. He started working at Langley, NACA, the predecessor to NASA, in 1955 as a co-op, and he continued working at the Langley Research Center after graduation. Chet transferred to the Space Task Group, which was the group that, when NASA was formed, it was the first group that sort of was in charge of manned space flight, eventually became the Johnson Manned Spacecraft Center. So he joined in 1961, moved to Houston in 62. He became the Propulsion and Power Division Engineering Directorate. Worked in that directorate until 1993. He's been a section head there in the Reaction Control Section, Branch Chief, Thermal Test Branch, and Division Chief, Propulsion and Power Division. After he ended up also being the Chief Engineer for the NASA Associate Administrator, the Office of Spaceflight, for 12 months. He was acting Deputy Director of Marshall Space Flight Center for 6 months, and been on a large number of teams that were investigating problems and some hard things we were gotten involved in over the years. He retired after 42 years of service, went to work for Boeing for 10 years. His primary assignment during Apollo was in all aspects: design, development, certification, and flight support of the reaction control system propulsion. So you're going to see we have a diverse group, and that's Chet Vaughn. Right here at the end of the table is Bill Carpenter. Dr. Carpenter finished medical school at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and then completed an aerospace medicine residency
at Ohio State University in 1965. He was a NASA flight surgeon from 65 to 71, participated in many Gemini and Apollo missions. He then did a fellowship in nuclear medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, Houston, and had a 30-year career in the field of nuclear medicine, where he became the division director of nuclear medicine at the Scott and White Clinic in Temple, Texas. He served as a consultant in nuclear medicine and aerospace medicine at the Johnson Space Center 2003 to 2013. Following the final Mercury flight, there was a significant post-flight decrease in orthostatic tolerance, which was also noted during tilt testing following the first 2 Gemini flights. The next 2 flights were going to be progressively longer, and it was recommended that a flight surgeon be trained to jump from the rescue helicopter with the underwater demolition team swimmers should medical assistance be required on landing. Bill had the experience in both competitive swimming and scuba diving and volunteered to train for this job. He was deployed as the helicopter recovery physician on Gemini 5, 6, 7, and 9. As the Gemini program was drawing to a close, Dr. Carpenter was transferred to the Apollo Medical Operations and Planning and was assigned to be the crew flight surgeon for Apollo 7, the first Apollo mission. Bill was assigned to the primary rescue helicopter that picked up the crew on Apollo 11 and took the crew over to the USS Hornet. Both he and NASA engineer John Hirosaki, who had come in contact with moon dust, were confined with the astronauts for their 21-day quarantine. In the period following the release from isolation, the publicity demands on the crew became so great that Bill was sometimes pressed into service to make public appearances in their place. And after the United States Department of State publicists concluded that he was famous enough, during the travel on Air Force One, he would be registered by crew in the flight manifest under the initials WFP for World Famous Physician. And I understand it's a moniker that still travels around with him. Bill Carpenter. Sitting next to, and like I said, this is experience-wise a very diverse panel, and you'll see this as we go through this. Next to Bill is Bob Hoken, graduated from Southwestern State College in Oklahoma, Weatherford, Oklahoma. I come from Central State College in Edmond, Oklahoma, so we do have that in common. Degree in math and chemistry, went to grad school in math at OU, but left after one semester to join NASA in 1964. Initially, he worked on Lunar Ascent and Mission Planning and Analysis Division, but transferred to flight control training after a few months. Started out in the flight dynamics area of training organization because of experience gained while he was in mission planning and analysis. He staffed the simulation dynamics console responsible for training the flight dynamics guys in the front row mission control, and served as a simulation coordinator that took care of simulation script coordination and served as a backup simulation supervisor during Apollo. Stayed in training for most of his career. However, he was a flight controller during Skylab, responsible for the Skylab Apollo telescope mount. After Apollo, he held numerous management positions, including division chief over training and division over training and facilities at one time. He retired from NASA in 1998, and he worked for the Japanese space program for several years and had his own company for 5 years before he really retired in 2005. Now I'm going to come back to Rick here shortly. I want to skip over him. Yep. Of course, Jack Schmitt only had 8 pages of stuff that I could quote from, and so we don't have the time for that. You folks certainly know who he is. There are a few things I want to point out. It's interesting to me that he's been a geologist, had been an astronaut, a university professor, and of course a senator from New Mexico. And he was on board during the last lunar mission, Apollo 17. He became the first member of NASA's first scientist astronaut group. Jack also remains the first and only professional scientist to have flown beyond low Earth orbit to have visited the moon. Jack resigned from NASA in August 1975 in order to run for election to the United States Senate as a member from New Mexico. Served for one term. Jack, towards the end of your term, shuttle was beginning to fly, and I'm thinking back in those days, being on board the shuttle on top of that rocket was probably more hazardous than you being a senator in Congress. Today, you may know where I'm going with this, right? Yeah, today, I'm thinking probably the safest place you could be.
Controllers.
There you go. I think the safest place for you to be today between those two choices would be on the top of a big rocket instead of in Washington, D.C. God bless you. Thank you for your service there. He received a BS degree in geology from California Institute of Technology in 1957 and then spent studying geology at the University of Oslo in Norway. He received a PhD in geology from Harvard University in '64. Basically based on his geological field studies in Norway. Before joining NASA as a member of the first group of scientists, astronauts in '65, he worked on the U.S. Geological Survey Astrogeology Center at Flagstaff, developing geological field techniques that would be used by the Apollo crews. Following his selection, he spent his first year at Air Force undergraduate pilot training, learning to become a jet pilot. Upon his return to the astronaut corps in Houston, he played a key role in training Apollo crews over all that time. The thing, Jack, that I think interesting, very interesting from the standpoint of awards and honors, I'm not going to go through all of them, but there were three that really stood out. The fact that you have a school, elementary school, in Silver City named after you, Harrison Schmitt Elementary School. I think that's probably one of the nicest things that you've ever received. You also had a special award named for you. It was the American Association of Petroleum Geologists, and they came up with an award for folks who couldn't be available for their award but be outside the company organization, and they called that the Harrison Schmitt Award. And I think that's very, very, very clever. And so welcome. Glad to see you. Been a while.
Yep.
By the way, these guys aren't going to get any time to talk, so. John Stonecipher is next. John was born in Hanover, Pennsylvania. He attended Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. The Korean War had started, and he joined the U.S. Navy in his senior college year and spent 4 years in the Navy as an aerographer. 2 of these years were spent at a fleet weather center in North Africa, providing weather forecasts for ships operating in the Mediterranean Sea and aircraft operations into southern Europe and across Africa. John completed his college degree at the University of Miami with a BS in physics after separation from the Navy. John is one, along with Chet, of one or two people here that have worked for the Space Task Group. John joined Langley Research Center in '57. He assisted in the conduct of aeronautic research and analytic and wind tunnel model testing to determine characteristics of wing and tail surfaces of high-performing military aircraft. Amongst these tests, he conducted a reentry stability test of a very small model of the Mercury capsule. John was a member of the Space Task Group, which became the Manned Spacecraft Center. John, with his Navy experience, went to work in the recovery branch of the Operations Division, moving to Houston in 1961. Early on, with recovery personnel, he assisted in planning and preparing documentation requirements for positioning ships and aircraft for the approaching John Glenn flight. John and I have worked together. It's been a pleasure. He's been on many recovery ships as a team leader. It's always been a good time to be with him, John Stonecipher. And I think that leaves Rick. Rick Schuring. This International Space Medicine Summit does certainly sound like it has, we're talking about the human. We do have experiences here that are very diverse, but in my opinion, if we're going to spend certainly longer times in space and go great distances, taking care of the humans is going to be a huge challenge. We know that. I discovered that Rick's been involved in something. He did not support the Apollo program, but he's going to kick this off here shortly, and because of what I'm about to tell you. He's a flight surgeon at the NASA Johnson Space Center, an associate professor of military and emergency medicine at the Uniformed Services University, Health Sciences in Bethesda, Maryland. He also serves as a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Preventive Medicine and Community Health at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, and teaches at UTMB Aerospace Medicine Residency. He received his BA degree from Eastern Illinois University and a Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine from the Chicago College of Osteopathic Medicine, and is board certified in family practice. He served as a family sports medicine physician in private practice until 2002, when he entered the Aerospace Medicine Residency at White State University, earning an MS degree in Aerospace Medicine. Rick completed the Musculoskeletal Ultrasound Fellowship at the Detroit Medical Center, earning board certification in orthopedic ultrasound in 2013. Dr. Schuring is a fellow of Aerospace Medicine Association and American Academy of Family Physicians. His initial work at NASA included serving as co-lead of the Constellation Program's medical operations team from 2005 to 2010, and project manager of the Apollo Medical Operations Project in 2006. Rick worked with many of the surviving Apollo astronauts, flight directors, and controllers to understand factors that affect the crew health and performance on the lunar surface and launch recovery operations. Also during this time frame, he supported 9 space shuttle launch and landing missions as the DoD air doc out of Patrick Air Force Base. In 2010-2011, he supported STS-132 as deputy crew surgeon. After returning from Iraq with the U.S. Army in 2011, he helped create the NASA Musculoskeletal Medicine and Rehabilitation Program in conjunction with the Houston Methodist Hospital Department of Orthopedic Surgery, and a NASA astronaut strength conditioning and rehabilitation specialist. In this capacity, Rick has researched a number of astronaut training injuries, including shoulder issues related to training in the spacesuits and in the NBL, something he has done personally several times to gain insight into the injury biomechanics. In 2010, he earned a certification as a Space Station Medical Operations Flight Surgeon and has supported 3 Space Station increment missions, currently serving as lead increment surgeon for Space Station Expedition 53. Prior to joining NASA in 2004, Rick has served as a flight surgeon in the U.S. Army Reserves, flying combat medical missions in Operation Iraqi Freedom, and as the battalion flight surgeon supporting medevac missions in the Balkans. He currently serves as an instructor for the Defense Medical Readiness Training Institute Combat Casualty Care Course at Fort Sam, Houston, and Operation Bushmaster and the Advanced Combat Medical Experience courses. His professional interests focus on injury, biomechanics, physiological effects of extreme environments, and crew survival in space. He is a private pilot, diver, and avid mountain biker in his spare time. In his spare time. I give you Dr. Schuring.
Thanks, Bill. I think after you heard the background of my esteemed panelists, you realize I'm here for the comic relief. Clearly, I have the least experience in terms of Apollo, but the one thing I think...
You're here to protect us, is what I said.
The contribution I was able to really make really came at the request of our medical operations manager back in 2005, J.D. Polk, who at the time the Constellation program started, Jeff Jones and I were assigned as the Constellation surgeons who would basically be working to return lunar missions. And JD, for those of you who know JD, which is basically everybody, he said, you know, we have a tendency at NASA to reinvent the wheel. Before we go and do these missions, why don't we go back and see how they actually did it since they were successful missions, and then see how we can kind of build on that experience. And that was really kind of the genesis of the Apollo Medical Operations project, which Milt said I oversaw. And this was important because during the time these gentlemen were working these missions, I was 5 years old. I mean, to sit there and be in charge of the return to lunar medical portion with Jeff, without that experience, you know, didn't make much sense. So going back and doing this project was very helpful. And I wanted to point out that this was not a recrudescence of the results found in the biomedical results of Apollo. This is more from an operational standpoint. How'd you do the mission? What were the gotchas? What could we do differently the next time around? So basically, we had three goals for that project: to modify medical requirements that were being built into Orion and the new spacesuits, at the time the LSAM, the Lunar Surface Ascent Module, the habitat. So we wanted to take what we learned from this group and really make sure that we got it right the next time around. We also wanted to develop a centralized database. You know, one of the toughest things about doing the Apollo research was the fact that there was no centralized database where you could go and look for questions. It was all over the place. And again, this is 2005-06 timeframe. So, I mean, the internet was up and running, but certainly wasn't as easy to access data. So we want to make sure there's one repository that future generations could go to and have this information that we learned. And also to share the relevant Apollo information with all the other stakeholders that were involved, EVA suit, the vehicle, all kinds of folks, to make sure that, again, the lessons that we learned from our prior generation was captured. But then there was a serendipitous thing that really took place, and this is one of the best things I think that came out of this, was that along the constellation development timeline, and I know Jeff's back there and he's starting to get post-constellation stress disorder symptoms, things would come up where we were battling with the Lockheed folks, the requirement folks about this, that, or the other thing, and we'd just be scratching our heads about stuff. And I could literally get on the phone and call Jack, I could call Gene Cernan, Neil Armstrong, anybody, and say, hey, guys, I know you guys had to deal with this. What did you do back then? One great example was the 144-hour deep press scenario. You know, this situation where the crew's on the moon, they get back to their spacecraft, they get a micrometeoroid hit, and they've got 6.5 days to get back to Earth, but they got to get in their spacesuits to survive. How do they do that? And that's a head scratcher. And we spent 3 months looking at nursing home populations, how you live in stool and urine and all this kind of stuff. And finally, like, we're not getting anywhere. And I just sent the gentleman an email and said, guys, what did you do in Apollo for this? Because I'm sure you worked it. And in his typical fashion, Mr. Armstrong sends me an email back and says, Dear Dr. Schering, my memory is short on the subject, but here's what I remember. And then sends me 3 pages of details about what they did. And the bottom line was, keep it simple, build a thicker hull, and don't worry about stacked failures, because you can't work around that. And it was brilliant. Stuff like that would happen, and to this day I could still call and just kind of work with these guys on stuff. So we had 64% participation among the living Apollo astronauts. I posed 285 questions to them that through my research I could not find had ever been asked before, and they were primarily about crew health and performance. That's what we were really looking at. I was not recreating all the things that had been asked in Apollo, which was extensive. But this was really looking at, how'd you do the mission? What were the things that were going to make it better, worse? What could we do differently? We got 107 recommendations from the Apollo astronauts on what we should do the next time around. And many of those requirements, Jeff and I and Jen Fogarty, we were able to kind of work into the current requirement structure to at least, or if it didn't make its way into it, and I think about at that time 27% of those recommendations actually found their way into the requirements, with the other 77% kind of hanging out there to think about. At least we had that from the teams that did the missions. We looked at EVA suit things. The dexterity of the glove was a huge issue for the Apollo crews. They were at 3.75 PSI, which is better than the suit pressure we use today. But the A7LB suit did not have a waist ring in it. So if you ever wondered why the Apollo astronauts did the kangaroo hop, it's because they figured out on the lunar surface it was actually more metabolically efficient to get around than trying to force trying to do this kind of just normal walking because you didn't have a waist ring. You had no way to bend forward. I mean, things like that, were priceless things that we learned about. Improving the visor visibility. When they fell, which they fell fairly frequently, they couldn't see their outstretched hand because of the way the visor was devised. So work something into that. Build a HUD display to call up your consumables, life support, things like that, just right there, going off the technology that we use, in the military pretty frequently. Lunar surface operations, we learned very quickly dust is bad. You've got to work the dust out. And that was something that really we started building into our new systems. We talked about in-flight illnesses, muscular injuries, vast majority of things. The waste management system was the bane of a lot of the crew's existence. Most folks don't know about. There was no toilet on the Apollo command module. They had a bag. And this became a very interesting interchange with the Lockheed Martin engineers at one point because Jeff and I are sitting in this meeting and we're 5,000 pounds overweight for Orion, and we had the project manager for Lockheed Martin say, the toilet you guys want weighs about 48 pounds. We can't have it. We're going to go back to the old Apollo system. And I said, well, let me tell you about that system. It was a bag, and you kind of just stood up because you didn't have a way to squat down, and you tried finding your part, and you pooped. And frequently stuff was floating, and it was nasty. And that was stuff that was not in the news, was not anywhere you could find it, but definitely had impacts into the crew's appetite, how you function, how you did things. The toilet's important. Humans need a toilet. And the discussion digressed into differences between male and female anatomy, which we had to explain. But anyway, things like that. Potable water. It's really important to have hot water. And we got into a big fight about that. There's no way to have hot water. And then some really smart engineers said, you know what, there's a way to take the heat from the avionics and actually use that to heat the water. We can give you guys heat water. So all those experiences those guys had, again, didn't make the news, but certainly were important for our crew. We were able to incorporate into this. And one of the last things, just about the flight surgeon crew interaction, the crews were very protective about having the Apollo flight surgeon there initially. And eventually we had them there, but they really wanted to have crew communication maintained and felt that a lot of the crew were experimental animals. But I got both sides of the story, as it often exists, from Bill, from Dr. Berridge, folks. And Apollo flight docs at that time were in a rock and a hard place. You're company docs, but you're the crew docs. And I think we've built a lot on that experience working and being advocates for our crew. But it wasn't like that back then. It was a very, very, very different mission for those guys, and I salute what they did. So just in summary, I just want to say the recommendations from the Apollo astronauts that we learned was start with what worked on Apollo and then prove to me why something should be different. And in Gene Cernan's words, and I remember Captain Cernan saying this again and again and again, and this is a poor imitation, is, better is evil of the good enough. And that was the attitude. Keep it simple. Make sure it's not so complicated it's going to fail, and then you're stuck. And then just do the right thing. So that was kind of my contribution. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Rick. And Bill, why don't you start now? Bill Carpentier, and about 7 minutes worth or so. Okay.
I'll try.
Okay.
I was an operational flight surgeon during Gemini and Apollo. And during Gemini, my main job was to do pre-flight and post-flight medical evaluations. And at the end of the Gemini program, I was given a challenge. And that challenge was to develop the medical requirements for the Apollo program. Now, it had previously been decided that there was not going to be enough crew time in flight to do any in-flight experiments, so all I had to develop was the requirements for pre- and post-flight medical examinations. Now, there was hesitancy expressed around the center about the amount of crew time that could be devoted to pre- and post-flight medical exams. And there were opinions expressed that it had been shown in the Gemini program that 2 crew members could tolerate 14 days in space, and that was longer than a lunar landing mission that would be planned, and so therefore we didn't need to do any more medical examinations. So, but there were a lot of us that disagreed with that although we had learned a lot during Gemini and in Mercury, there were many, many gaps in our knowledge. So working with the Apollo Program Office, I was able to develop 3 medical requirements that were acceptable. And those objectives were to ensure crew health and safety from a medical standpoint, prevent back contamination from the lunar surface, and 3, to continue the understanding of the biomedical changes incident to spaceflight. Now, since I was going to be the crew flight surgeon assigned to the first Apollo flight, I worked closely with the flight surgeons in the medical division and the investigators in the research division to develop a plan that would fulfill these objectives and still be accepted by the Apollo crew members. So the evaluations we came up with included 6 areas: clinical evaluations, microbiological evaluations, clinical hematology and biochemistry, red cell mass and plasma volume changes, bone mineral changes, and cardiovascular changes in orthostatic tolerance that was going to use lower body negative pressure, and in exercise capacity using a bicycle ergometer. Our goal was to be able to do these evaluations 3 times pre-flight and post-flight as many as we could. So before we presented this program to the crew, I had every test done on me at least twice. We timed every test very carefully to see how we could get it done most efficiently and most accurately and take the least crew time. And I also got everybody to run 3 control subjects the day before we were going to do any evaluations on the crew members so that we could get everything in order in the best time. Now, when we presented this program to the crew, it was not met with a great deal of enthusiasm. However, after considerable discussions with the crew on outlining what we needed to learn and the consequences of not knowing this, and assuring them that we could do all these evaluations in less than 3 hours of their time, they agreed to proceed with the first evaluation. So we were able to keep our word, do all the evaluations in the time we said, and at 30 days prior to flight, and then we were able to repeat it at F-15 and F-5 days prior to flight, and we were able to get the same data the day of recovery and the day after recovery. And so most of these studies were repeated on 8 of the following 10 remaining Apollo flights, and some basic data was obtained on those 2 flights. Now, I was also going to be assigned to be the crew flight surgeon for the first lunar landing mission. So I had to work out a program that I could do by myself in the MQF with the investigators outside recording the information. I couldn't do LBNP in the quarantine trailer, so the only thing I could come up with is lying a crew member on the dining table for 5 minutes and then standing him up for 5 minutes to get some idea of changes in orthostatic tolerance. I was able to remove one of the seats in the MQF and mount the bicycle ergometer so I could do an exercise test, collect expired air and get all that information. And I was able to get all of the blood samples that were required and process them properly so that they could be further analyzed in the LRL. It was easy to get all the microbiological samples. So I also took a course in basic nuclear physics and nuclear medicine so that I was qualified to be able to inject radiopharmaceuticals so I can continue getting data on plasma volume and red cell mass loss. So we managed to collect a reasonable set of data during the pre-flight and post-flight acquisition during the Apollo program. So what did we learn? Well, we further validated the findings that were documented during Project Mercury and during the Gemini program, and we obtained a lot of new information on the physiological changes that were happening, the possible causes, and what may be done to treat or prevent these adverse findings. Now, from Mercury through Apollo, post-flight and pre-flight exams were done on 34 individual astronauts. 19 of them flew 1 mission, and 15 flew 2 to 4 missions, for a total of 59 manned missions for all 3 programs. Now, this data has never been put together, and some of it is difficult to find, very difficult to find. So my current project since I retired, semi-retired, I failed retirement twice, but anyway, is to try to remedy this situation. So I have been able to find and document every single number that was collected during the Mercury and Gemini program. I have documented 90% of all the data in the Apollo program, and I expect to be able to get 100% within the next couple of months. So I've also been working to publish this data along with a preliminary integrated analysis of all 3 programs. So I have been recently able to obtain consent from all Gemini and all Apollo astronauts except 2, and I have basic data from the literature on those 2. So there were common post-flight findings noted from the first Mercury flight to the last Apollo flight, and this included weight loss, increased heart rate, both supine and during standing, during tilt, and during LBNP, and this correlated with the decreases in systolic pressure and pulse pressure. Multiple crewmen had measured decrease in exercise capacity and a decreased blood volume. However, these findings varied considerably from crewman to crewman, and then the same crewman in different flights and different programs. Now, some of this data has been published, but what has never been published is how much of this data is interrelated. So it appears to me that when trying to do correlations and develop predictive models for short-term space flights, that the rate of change is more important than the absolute change. Now, for example, the average weight of weight loss per day is highly correlated with caloric intake per day. Both of these factors are correlated with the average rate of plasma loss per day and the rate of increase in heart rate per day and the decrease in systolic pressure. And the orthostatic tolerance tests all correlated with the exercise capacity tests. And for both of these flights, the post-flight measurements were highly correlated with the pre-flight measurements. So it looks, if you know a pre-flight heart rate, either supine or during the orthostatic stress, and you know the change in plasma volume per day, you can predict the post-flight standing heart rate within 5 beats per minute. And you can get almost as good of a correlation just by knowing caloric intake per day or knowing weight loss per day. Now, post-flight LBNP is a little bit more difficult to predict. It's more variable, but it's still highly correlated. So my preliminary analysis of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs suggests that at least 90% of the post-flight cardiovascular changes are predictable, and I think they are largely preventable. And all the shuttle data that I've been able to look at shows the same pattern. So it appears to me, if my calculations are correct, that significant changes in orthostatic tolerance or exercise capacity for short-term spaceflight may be largely prevented by doing 2 things. And the first is getting in shape pre-flight, and that can be defined as having a pre-flight oxygen consumption of 30 to 35 cc's per kilo at a heart rate of 160, and then 2, having an in-flight intake of 30 to 35 kilocalories per kilogram of body weight of Apollo diet per day. So hopefully I will be able to publish all this data in the next year or so, and it will then be available for further research and further interdisciplinary and integrated analysis by other investigators, hopefully some people in this audience. Thank you.
It's very good, Bill. Thank you. Bob Halkin.
Well, first I want to thank you, Milt, for the introduction.
About 7 minutes. Okay.
And thank George for the invitation. Feel a little bit intimidated by this group, but I'll stick. From operations, we always have an opinion on everything, but I'll try to stick to training. First off, in terms of lessons learned, you usually describe a lesson learned as you've done it right and you've done it wrong, and then you know which is right. But kind of like what was said earlier, we did a lot of things right. That's the only way we could do them. So some of these won't be we did it right and wrong. We just did it, and that seemed to be the right thing. First one I want to mention is people. I think you always want to ensure that a large number of your management and your leadership are people-oriented and team-oriented. I think we were fortunate in Apollo to have a lot of people that came from the military and were in the management. We also had the military detailees. And from where I came in right out of school. And the leadership and management were all team-oriented. They were all people-oriented. The synergy was really important. I don't know how you achieve that, but every organization wants it, whether you're government or commercial. Second, we had a badgeless environment. I don't know that you can do that anymore. But I came to work in mission operations, and I worked for a contractor for
several months. Didn't realize it was a contractor. Several years before I realized what an RFP or procurement was. It was just an environment where you had Air Force, military, you had contractors. We were all just a team. The badges were a little different, but I didn't realize there was a difference for a long time. I don't know that you can ever get back there. Use real hardware and software where possible when you're training. A couple of reasons. Obviously, you want the most real environment, and I would expect even in the medical community, you would want to do everything just like you're going to do it in flight. The other thing it does, besides giving you a more realistic environment, it ties those people in the back room doing software and hardware to the operations people and to the crew, and I think that's extremely important. Use small, efficient software code. I don't know that you can do that. Back when the hardware was so small that the software was all very small, very efficient. Every piece of software has bugs. You got a lot more bugs when you got big, bulky software, but you're probably faced with that in the future. If there's some way to keep it small, try. Our script philosophy when we wrote scripts was always on trying to make the crew as intelligent and able to handle any situation. But the other thing we wanted was confidence in the systems. Most of us are aware that a lot of times you take an action, it's the worst thing you can do. If the system is healthy and you really believe in your system, then that's more important than having a knowledgeable crew. And we did that all through Sims, but always the last simulation would be perfectly nominal, and that was to send the crew to the Cape feeling like this thing you're sitting on top of is really going to work. We didn't want people to have a lack of confidence in the system, so it was always holding yourself back as a simulation person. Don't overdo it. You don't want them afraid of the system. Understanding program risk. I think everybody in the program, I came in at 21 years old, and I knew there was a lot of risk in the program, and I heard a lot of people at my level and levels above me say that I think God might be spending 25% of his time on this program just keeping us safe. We weren't afraid of it, but we knew there was a lot of risk. I worked on later programs, and I personally did not feel the risk was explained as well. The Challenger was it was a big thing to all of us. I don't think we realized, a lot of us didn't realize how big the risk was. And that's something you got to remember, that everybody in the program has to understand program risk, and you have to hang on to that and make sure that you bring it to work every day. Material for, stop me, I'm just rambling.
All right, you got about 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll go fast. Material for simulation scripts. We, simulation guys all attended the flight techniques meetings, which were held in an open forum. Bill Tyndall was a big driver to that, and we used to call them Tyndallgrams, but we would go to those and the mission rule reviews, the mission rationale reviews, and we would look for areas where, in a forum like this, the big guys up here are arguing the pros and cons and they have to make a decision. Sim guys would sit in the back, and if there was a big argument, we'd make sure we did a simulation of that. That was just a way of making sure that we were able to play the whole role. Scripts, again, they focused on team building. They never stopped us from doing things in the Sims, but we worked real hard to make sure that we'd find those folks that may have been a little bit autocratic. And when you go hire people at the top of their class, top 10% of their class, and put them to work, a lot of people are autocrats. They think they know everything. And I was responsible for the flight dynamics group, which was in the trench. We had people like Jay Green and others who were very strong-minded. And we would try to work scripts where a part of the puzzle was in the back room and they didn't have it. And when they stubbed their toe, we would put something else in that made it look really bad. The nice thing was that smart people adjust quickly and don't do it twice. So we did do a lot of that. There were a lot of people in the back room that we worked on. Script execution. We'd have a script planned in detail, but as I said, we would change it if necessary to try to make a point. If somebody, whether it was a crewman or a controller, did something that was a little bit off of the normal procedure, might not have been a big thing, except in a simulation, we could make it a big thing. We would just go put something, a roadblock down that said, if you hadn't done that, this wouldn't happen. And so it's again, trying to keep people on the path. Integrated training exercises, the training team always stayed invisible for an entire simulation. You tried to make it as real as possible. The flight directors disciplined their team to say that you're not allowed to say this isn't realistic. You played it for real. And the flight directors did that. We just stayed in the back, and if something went wrong, we would just play like it was a malfunction. The computers didn't always execute the way they should have. We just play it for real. Debriefings after a simulation, they were led by the flight director, and each member, including the crew, was allowed to wash their laundry in public and say what they had done wrong. The sim team just stayed quiet. The best sim supervisors that I ever worked with, Jay Honeycutt was an example, never said anything. When it was all over, he'd just say, well, you caught all the problems. If they did miss something, just simply say you missed something. We didn't say who made a mistake. You just missed something. Let the flight director and the team sort out how that happened and who made the mistake. And management was tolerant of mistakes. I don't know how you can make that happen, but I, for one, know that I made several mistakes. I thought I would be disciplined, possibly relieved of duty, and there was no consequence. And I think that's when you're in the job and doing the best you can and make a mistake, management tolerance is something that I think you have to have if you're going to keep good people. I think that's really all I had. I could go on and on, but I think I've used
I'm sure well, absolutely. Each one of you, I'm hoping the audience in a little bit when we open it up for Q&A that you'll have some good questions because they got more they can cover. I've served in mission control as a flight controller and a flight director, and hardest part of it, people ask me, well, what's the toughest part of your job? And I said, you know what, being in mission control during a mission, not training, but during the mission, quite frankly, that's the easiest part of the business. It's getting ready to be in mission control. To do a mission, that's the hardest part. And it's hard to use the word benefited from simulation supervisors in a sim team, because when I say I benefited from them, I would usually leave the mission control center really pissed off a lot of the times and really irritated that we just stumbled so bad over certain things. But by golly, it made a difference. And so you're only as, and really unsung heroes of the whole business have been the people that get the astronauts and get the people in mission control ready to do the mission. Jack, I'm going to, not yet, I'm letting you, I'm going to save you for last. Uh-oh. John Stonecipher, your turn, John. Okay, about 7 minutes worth or so.
My job was the fun job compared to these fellas. It doesn't take a rocket science to determine that we're going to launch people into space. They're going to travel around the globe. They're coming back. What are we going to do? So NASA doesn't have a Navy. They don't have an Air Force. So the beginning work began. We were across the river, across the bay from Norfolk when we were at Langley. So we were given some Navy contacts to go across and talk to somebody at the Navy. And they didn't understand the job either, so they shuffled off one after another. Finally, we went to the Marines and down the road, and that's where we began our helicopter work. We knew we had to get these people out of the spacecraft or get the spacecraft back to the ship. So it grew from there, and finally, along the way, one of the best agreements that I've ever heard of was signed by the Defense Secretary of the Defense and our NASA administrator, James Webb. The direction to the DoD function was, you will support NASA to the fullest extent without interference on your normal defense. And believe me, that was followed throughout our Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. We never had any problems when we issued the requirements to the Navy and the Air Force through the DoD representative. They fell in line, and going out on the ships and flying in the aircraft with those, I cannot praise their work and their support enough. But anyway, let me go into a little bit about as I said, we prepared the requirements to the Navy. Many times the Navy said, don't tell us how to do the job, just give us your requirements and back off. Well, it didn't always work that way, but I used to tell everybody going out on the ship, Milt will remember this, don't tell them how to do it. Just suggest you have some experience based on a previous mission or a previous ride on the ship. Let me just make some suggestions, and it worked well throughout. But one of the things that I'd like to bring up to you folks, none of you, I think, could ever guess the number of ships that were involved in our Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program. Over 300 different ships supported us throughout the missions, hundreds and hundreds of aircraft. And this was a challenge for us because each time we'd send, well, let me back off, we would put a representative, a NASA representative on each ship, on each one of the destroyers. Many of them hated that ride on a destroyer, especially if they were out there circling circles in the ocean, and you had a launch slip, and their 7 or 8 days at sea ended up being 30 days. But anyway, we had to, and on the carriers, we sent out a team made up of a public affairs official, the physicians, somebody to work with the swimmers, somebody to put the electronics on the helicopters, and it was a great effort, team effort by all of them. But because of the number of ships and the number of aircraft, each time we went out, we had different people, so the training was extensive. We sent boilerplates all over the world, boilerplate so that they could put a boilerplate in the water, sail off, see if they could find it, and bring it aboard. Took all kinds of special equipment. We built special equipment for the destroyers. And when you modify a Navy ship, you have a lot of work to do. But the cranes that we put on the ships worked well. But to give you an example of the number of ships, for example, would you believe for John and Glenn's flight, we had 20 ships spread across the water, the Atlantic. We had an aircraft carrier at the end of each revolution, 3 aircraft carriers. And we evolved with our experience and, of course, knowing a little bit more about space flight and where these spacecraft were going to land. We ended up with Gemini anywhere from maybe 10 to 12 ships, and some in the Atlantic, some in the Pacific. In the Apollo, believe it or not, we were down to 5 or 6. An aircraft carrier in the primary area, and a destroyer somewhere else, someplace. Sometimes we had a ship, 1 or 2 in the Atlantic, and most of the Apollo landings were in the Pacific. We had a number of challenges, as you might guess, dealing with different people, different ships. But the real challenge we had during the Vietnam War was the Navy supplying the ships to meet our requirements, and especially in the Pacific. And I'll never forget the incident. We were coming up on Apollo 8, and it was a task that we hadn't briefed the Navy on what was going to happen and what support we needed in the Pacific. So Dr. Kraft was asked to go brief the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific, Admiral McCain. He gave the briefing to Admiral McCain and told him the kind of support we needed, realizing that some of the ships were in the line off Vietnam. The rest of them, because it was over Christmas, were back in port, and the sailors were on leave. After the briefing, the admiral said to Kraft, there was a fine briefing. He turned around to his admirals and generals, says, give this man what he wants. So it was a good example of this agreement that had been signed many years prior to the flight of Apollo. The real challenge then we faced, which was quite different, and Bill and Milt will remember this, was the quarantine and isolation on Apollo 11. They developed a number of pieces of special equipment. Bill and Milt mentioned the mobile quarantine facility. Many people will think, oh, that was just an Airstream trailer. Believe me, it was a highly modified Airstream trailer. And it worked well, as Bill will vouch. And we did a lot of work with the swimmers because they had special procedures. And the crews did, the Apollo 11 crew did go out into the Gulf of Mexico, and we went through a simulation there so that they got familiar with the procedures and what the swimmers would do. And but the biggest concern also we had was the president came on board. And working with the Secret Service for weeks prior to the mission was quite interesting. They listened. They wanted to know what we were going to do. They wanted to know the procedures and how we had done our work leading up to this so that the president could be safe. And I mentioned that to him we had briefed our procedures to this interagency committee on back contamination, representatives from the Department of Congress, Department of Agriculture, the CDC, all those people that were concerned what these lunar pathogens might do to the environment, to the ocean. So anyway.
And you had to bring that up.
Had to bring that up. We had to, yes. You may have to do it again. I hope not. Not if you go back to the moon.
The way it's headed, we won't go.
So anyway, but the concern was the president's going to be on board. What happens if you break isolation or quarantine? Well, believe it or not, I worked out with the Secret Service man, the head man, and when we got the astronauts on board, I checked with the helicopters, I checked with communications, and found out everything out on the water went well, just as procedures called for. And once they were on board, I was in contact with John Hirosaki, the engineer, kept watching the instruments, knowing that everything was going well. And at the first sign that things were not going well, I would salute the Secret Service man who was across the deck. He'd get the president off of there immediately. But I kept thinking one of the procedures, one of the directions I had, and I don't know how I would have ever followed it, that if you break quarantine and break isolation, that ship with all its occupants would have to stay at sea for 21 days, the quarantine period. And I continue to amaze and imagine what kind of communications would have come from the control center to the ship. Which way was the wind blowing? How sick were they? What did you do? But anyway, the things that we learned in Mercury, Gemini were worthwhile. We followed basically the same techniques, a lot of the same training, the simulations that we did for those other missions, and they all worked well, and we were successful in all the recoveries. Now, for the future, I don't know what the recovery is going to be. Milt's been out to watch them do it. My personal concern is the length of time that they may have to send in the spacecraft. I hope they don't have to spend much time in there, because Orion, like the rest of them, it's not a very good boat. And some of them were sick while they bobbed around out there in the spacecraft. So I hope that they can work a good recovery technique so that they are not bobbing around out there in the water very long. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, John. Chet, I'm going to give you 5 minutes and then go over to Jack, and then I want the folks to be thinking of questions for the panel.
Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is that I told you it took a great team to win the Astros, and we know about that because it happened this week. I also wanted to point out my tie, which has got all of the early missions on the tie, the emblems for them. So I want you to look at that during the day. So that's the reason I wore the shirt first, and now I want you to see the tie. When I joined the Space Task Group in 1961, the Mercury program was just getting ready to fly the first vehicles, the Mercury suborbital vehicles with Carpenter and then Gus Grissom with the second mission. Well, those missions hadn't happened yet. One of them, I believe, had already happened. I don't have those dates exactly in my mind, but the other one, I think, didn't happen until I was on my way to Houston in February or so of '62. The other thing that I would point out to you is that when we were, and I was in the engineering directorate for my whole duration at NASA. I mean, I varied off to a few other places on temporary duty for a while, but I was really basically assigned to engineering, Max for Jay. And Max and a team were a tremendous leader and had a good sense of hardware development, what it could do, what it couldn't do, what you had to do to make it happen. And so that's how the Mercury program got going in reasonably short time. The group in PARD, which is a Langley group, was shooting the rockets up from Wallops, learning about the high speed and shooting them back down so they could learn about the high speed entry and so they could design the heat shields on Mercury. We needed a similar kind of data for all of it. The bottom line is when we were doing that work, there was basically no design parameters on the table. I mean, we had to make up. We didn't make them up. But we did. They weren't existing. We write them down first and think about how they would affect things, and then we would have to go on with the system designs. But we didn't have any overall vehicle design tools and that sort of thing that's available to the communities today. So our iterations were small, but there was a reasonably small group, and they were able to coordinate that work. And by the way, this work was done not just by NASA. McDonnell Douglas, as you guys all know, I'm sure, at that time there was just McDonnell, I guess. But they were the prime contractor, and they did a super job on that. And the NASA team and the McDonnell team really worked closely together. At that time, you have to remember, we didn't know, on the Mercury, we didn't even have any Delta V capability with the spacecraft, except for deorbit. We had solids on it for deorbit, but the attitude control system was a hydrogen peroxide system that only provided a small amount of energy. So we had to go, and that was it was efficient peroxide system, but peroxide is not a very good propellant. So in order to increase the efficiency for the propulsion that you need to get either the Gemini and the Apollo, we needed to go to different propellants to reduce the weight. Weight was always an issue. On the Mercury program, the Atlas, that vehicle that launched that into space, the margins on the booster were like 1.1 as opposed to a 1.5 on safety factors. I mean, we really had low margins of safety. Some of those things were somewhat responsible for some of the earlier failures that we had when you see them lift off and drop back down in a launch pad, and a lot of that was going on in the 58, 59, and 60 time frame. So we had to develop our own requirements. We didn't have many system level stuff we had out there that we could get our hands on. There were very few components, but we did have a good team, both with the government and with the contractors. The hardware was already designed for the Mercury, so that gave us a good start. We had a good team designing it for Apollo. We were doing that work when I arrived in '61. So some of that work was already ongoing, trying to get the program defined, trying to get the requirements squared away, trying to do some early testing so we could understand what the job was. In the early days, I was working primarily the attitude control and Delta V systems. We'd never done any docking. We didn't know what it takes to dock at that time. We didn't know how much propellant we were going to use or what thrust levels we ought to have. We had to kind of make up those things. The thrust level was set kind of not arbitrarily, but between what's the smallest you can make, because in space you don't need much force as long as you don't have any high torques if you're willing to take a long time to do it. So that would be a little bit more efficient. But if it took too long, or if you couldn't manufacture it, that might be a reason that you wouldn't go to smaller thrusters. In fact, on Gemini, we had 25-pound thrusters that were primarily used for the attitude control, and we had failures on those thrusters on virtually every mission. We had 10 missions. Well, we had failures in terms of reduced thrust on 8 of the 10 missions, where the 25-pound thrusters were not producing the amount of thrust they should have. Later on, we found out after the program, when we were working really hard at that time trying to get to the bottom of it, there was a couple of causes, and either one of them could have caused it. I believe that what really caused it was just a a large particle got over a small orifice, trim orifice in that small engine. It was only like 28 thousandths. It doesn't take much to stop it up. And we were getting a low delta, we were getting a low flow rate into that thruster and had failures. Well, right after the last Gemini flight landed, and of course we worked that problem with Don Arabian and other people that were in the program and helping us work through it. We wanted to put on some instrumentation that would help us understand it, but we weren't able to get that program to agree to it. And I talked to the program manager after the program was over, and we talked about that subject a lot. And he told me, he said, well, if I admitted I had a problem, he said, it wouldn't let me fly the next mission. He says, not a problem for flying. You just guys don't understand why it's happening. So as long as we could tolerate what was happening, that was okay. We did have to find the root causes of it, and we got it fixed for Apollo. In Apollo, you didn't have that luxury, especially for the landing, because you got some torques that you got to be able to get control. And so we could not tolerate that level of thrust decay from a thruster. I remember getting an email through into our division from Dr. George Lowe saying, well, hey, guys, you had all these failures on Gemini. This is on December, I think was the last Gemini mission. He says, what are you guys doing to Apollo to be sure we don't have that? And I want the answer by the first of the year. So we had people who were really dedicated every day to trying to do the right thing, to make right things happen. We did not have basic material that we needed in terms of material compositions and capabilities. We had a lot of failures. We had the failures reasonably early. I say keep your program and get yourself from a design development standpoint. Build your hardware early. Don't try to take so long to build the first piece, because chances are the first piece is not going to work right. You're going to have to rework it some. So you need to do it early. Don't wait until you get all the answers. Now, sometimes people are afraid of failures, and you cannot be afraid of failures, especially in the development program, because that's what you learn from. And we did have a lot of failures. We got them corrected, and we're going forward. Significant issues that I would say, and one of the most significant management issue I would point out, is that we developed, and we did this after the Apollo 1 fire, which interrupted the whole program dramatically. It also caused us to do a lot of design work. It also provided us time to do more testing and so forth, so we had a better program coming out of that. It's very unfortunate that we lost the crew, and it always is. One of the messages I would tell our medical team and the rest of us, if we're going to continue a space program for a long time and give larger numbers of people, and we're going to have failures, and we'll probably lose people in space. We didn't do that yet, but we, we'll do our best to not do it, but you should not be so afraid of not going and doing something because you might fail. I think the agency and the country ought to think about that, think about what we'd do if we had someone lost in space. If you do enough of that stuff, things will eventually happen. We need to look at the redundancy that we're looking at, that you're looking at for the new programs. Maybe we can put rescue vehicles. I mean, you can stay in space for a long time if you have some extra crew systems kind of stuff, and a little propellant to keep you going. You might have a rescue mission that can come get you. But those kinds of things we need to be thinking about. I would caution you guys in the future of being a little bit careful about trying to define every requirements. And all due respect to the docs and the other folks, if we put too many requirements on the programs, it's going to load it down so hard, and it'll be hard to satisfy. I think, and I know the way it was in Apollo and Gemini and in Space Shuttle and International Space Station as well, we worked with all of the team, trying to be satisfying as much of the requirements as we knew we could do and still get the job done. So that's be my basic message. You got to watch out for contamination. You got to watch out for leakage. A leakage of a hydrogen seal, simple old seal, kept us from flying the space shuttle for 9 months in '90. And it was a big, big deal because we were trying to get a lot of missions off. But those kinds of things are going to happen in the program. Fortunately, we've been pretty lucky about not having in orbit, and we need to continue. It's not just luck. We did the work on the ground to prevent it, but if we do enough of that, it's someday going to happen to us tough in space. Apollo 13 being a prime example. We just didn't understand enough about that. It was not the best design. We fixed it. And fortunately, we got the crew back and moving. But the accident we had on Challenger is that's 24 missions we flew before we had an issue. So that was more than we flew on Apollo. Maybe on Gemini, I didn't add them up. But so the longer we do this, the more apt we are to have some issues. We ought to pay attention to detail every time and in all areas. And in order to be successful, that's what you're going to have to do. I'll end it with that. It's a tremendous engineering team we had, and a good ops team, and a good sim team, and a good crew. And I know you guys will keep that all up, so thank you.
Chet, excellent. I mean, and I can tell you have got a lot more, as does the whole panel here, too. Jack, why don't you finish up this little short stuff from each of you, and then we'll let the audience ask you some questions. Our comments.
Well, thank you, Milt. Again, I, like everyone else, want to thank George Abbey for getting this all put together. Let me start by saying that the bag for number 2 wasn't that bad. For Apollo, we could go to a low residue diet, so you didn't have to use it very, very often. But I will also add that in an overreaction to the fibrillation event on Apollo 15, we put too much potassium in the orange juice.
Off-nominal output.
And the bag does not do well when you have diarrhea. I figure I can say that in this crowd. So watch that. Watch overreactions, all right? Also, I might mention that I think this has been largely resolved, and Bill or Smith or somebody can say, but when I first entered the world of jet piloting, it was very clear that pilots and flight surgeons did not trust each other. And the primary reason I finally decided was that a flight surgeon could ground a pilot with a stroke of a pen. And so the communications were not good. And that pretty much lasted, I think, all the way through Apollo. It was very difficult to get pilots to really give all the information that a flight surgeon would have liked to have. I believe, from my very limited interaction since, that has probably changed. I think there's a great deal more trust, but you have to have that trust, so you have to keep it in the future as well. All of this would not have been possible if the overall management system, and I mean overall management system that was created for Apollo and matured, and particularly matured through the Apollo 1 fire, 204 fire. If that management system had not been of extraordinary high quality, and if I had one piece of advice for managing the future major efforts to return to the moon and on to Mars, you need to go back and try to replicate that system, at least as a starting point. That system had it developed many advantages. There certainly was a base of technology that it could rely on ultimately to succeed. The managers, middle-level managers were all experienced in complex programs. Not as complex as Apollo, but still experienced there. They had, as I said the other day, they had a massive number of young engineers and skilled workers who were dedicated to the job at hand, primarily, and some people, because it was a job they wanted to do and they believed in the geopolitical reason for doing it. Patriotism was an extraordinarily important part of it. But also the Sputnik generation that filled those, that we all came out of, was excited about the prospects of space, and young people still are today. That is one of the big advantages we have in recruiting, is that once you have a going program, you can recruit for it. There also was one specific decision made by President Eisenhower, in addition to developing a consensus, bipartisan consensus to create NASA. In January of 1960, if you look at T. Keith Glennon's diary, Eisenhower sent him a personal letter ordering him to begin the development of the super booster, which became the Saturn V. That was January of 1960, almost a year and a half before Kennedy made his announcement. And without that, I don't think we could have completed Apollo by the end of the decade. That we can't run 2 experiments, but I think that would be true. So Ike was an extraordinarily important player. You don't find that in his records and in his writings and things about space. In fact, you tend to find just the opposite, that he was not particularly interested. But clearly he realized that something was going to happen in deep space, and we needed a huge rocket for that. It certainly didn't need it for the military applications that were important at the time as well. Jim Webb played probably one of the most critical roles in that when he went around the horn and asked George Low and Bob Gilruth and Chris Kraft and people like that in the Space Task Group, how much was it going to cost to put a man on the moon and return safely to Earth? In those year dollars, he got estimates around $8 billion. So when he went to Congress, he said it's going to cost 16. So we had 100% management reserve. You have to have, for these kind of programs, you have to have a management reserve. Otherwise, what happens is what happened prior to the shuttle ever flying, is that you start to delay milestones in order to solve the unknown unknowns that are going to develop in a program as complex as we're talking about. And in fact, I was in the Senate when it was very clear that milestone delay had built a fence of milestones out there that you were not going to get through. You were never going to get to first launch at the current funding levels. And so Matthias and I began to try to get something going in the Carter administration to get supplemental budgets in order to get to first launch, and we were unsuccessful. Who was successful was Hans Mark. Hans Mark went to Jimmy Carter and said, you can't verify the SALT II treaty without the space shuttle, because all the national security payloads are only compatible with the space shuttle. And you can ask why. Well, because Hans Mark, when he was head of NRO, dictated that that be the case. Now, for what motivations, you'll have to ask Hans. But those 2 supplementals that we got then, after Carter became convinced, did buy us to the first launch. So there are all sorts of geopolitical issues that feed into these kinds of programs, and you have to keep those at least in the back of your mind, that they're very, very critical to the programs succeeding and moving forward. This also, we have to remember, and I think all of the people here at this panel will be able to remember, the NASA of Apollo was minimally layered. If somebody had a good idea on how to fix that thruster, the next morning, it would be in front of the CCB. That's right. And George Low would be evaluating it, right? Yes, and this was true at Marshall, it was true at the Cape. The events moved extremely fast because you only had 1 or 2 layers of discussion before you were in front of the people who were making the final decisions, engineering or operational. And that is one reason why in Apollo, between November of 1968 and November of 1969, we launched a Saturn V equivalent mission, including Apollo 7, every 2 months. Every 2 months, rocket and spacecraft. And if you look back even further in the Gemini program, it was every 6 weeks, right? We were flying Gemini every 6 weeks.
I was at sea all that time.
By the way, it was a wonderful experience to see those UDT guys, now known as SEALs, arriving at the spacecraft after splashdown. That was great, and they had that hatch open in no time at all.
Great.
We were starting to feel the effects of that boat that you described, but it worked out extremely well. It was really remarkable. So the entire Apollo program provides lesson after lesson after lesson of how to get started, at least on a major, complex space program, such as returning to the moon and then using the moon not only for additional understanding of our own planet, but also for developing the operations necessary to go to Mars. We don't know how to land on Mars yet. I know we figured it out, but we don't know how. Entry, descent, and landing is going to be very difficult. We're going to have large rocket systems that can fire into an atmosphere, even though it's not much of an atmosphere, but it has to reliably fire in the atmosphere. And as I said the other day, I think we're going to change our operational philosophy and we'll abort to the surface of Mars if we have a problem and fix that problem on Mars rather than come home. I can't imagine coming home after all that time and effort and money of going there. So hopefully that kind of thing will become generally accepted, and that we will engineer and plan our operations accordingly. And the moon gives us a chance to learn how to do all these things before we actually commit to that the human part of what it's going to take to deal with landing on Mars and operations on Mars. And with that, let's get some questions.
Well, thanks, Jack, and I enjoyed being on your recovery ship on Apollo 17. So
We appreciate you being there along with Goldwater and a few other people. Let me mention one thing about Sim Soup and the simulation. That was more fun. I participated in a couple of them. And also during the actual mission sims, the crew was sort of, at least I was, I'm very competitive, and I was competing with the flight controllers to try to find the problem that these guys were putting into the system before the flight control. I never did, but I kept trying to, and to come up with a solution. But Sim Soup had a very questionable reputation among everybody, flight controllers and crew. And I'll just tell you one story. Has nothing to do with lessons learned, but I was helping out on one of the Apollo 11 sims, and we had Neil and Buzz out on the surface. They weren't actually participating, but we had the crew out on the surface, and all of a sudden, problems started to develop in the lunar module, and they get worse and worse and worse. And finally, Cran said, "Get them in the cabin." And Capcom sent that up, and somebody said, "Well, what about the rock box?" And Grant said, "F the rock box, get him in the cabin." And the then director of the science director came out of his chair. He was participating in this, and he said, "What do you mean?" And that's how involved people got in these simulations. They were an extraordinarily important part of the whole preparation of the whole program, and I thank you very much for it.
So many stories, my goodness. I see the microphones are already in the audience, so I'm going to point right over to this young lady. Your question or comment?
Yes. Oh, thank you. What a great panel. This was awesome. I think we need to have you all back if we intend to do this again. Appreciate all the lessons learned. But I wanted to ask, are there any other gotchas that you might not have mentioned that are critical to the group that's here before you, which is a group that's going to participate in making it happen again?
How much time do you have?
Politics. You're going to have to live with politics, and that's I think somebody touched on it. The politics are going to be here, and you have to plant the seeds in the environment you're in now that will endure the next change of administration. One might look at something like mentioned science versus operations. Early on, we selected astronauts scarf and goggles, that has evolved a little bit, maybe not enough. In the long run, you're really looking at scientists that are going up in these things more than a scarf and goggles guy. And that means, I think, I said in the earlier session, somebody said that you need to get used to getting up in the morning and giving your blood sample, your urine sample, and so on. That's the science side of it. If you can plant that part of it, astronaut selection for the future, it's going to be really important because we're going to change administrations again.
So I would say to that what we have to do is be sure that we define the objective of what we're trying to do at the top level. In Apollo, we had that set, go to the moon and return safely by the end of the decade. That drove most of what we were trying to do because we had it. And we need a sense of urgency here, and I'm going to put it a little bit different, but Harrison did a super job of talking about the reserve, and that is a true story. I know that happened. I wasn't privy to the conversation, but I was privy to some people that were pretty close to the conversation. So what we need to do is be sure we're reserving some funds somewhere, because if you give it all to a contractor, and I've been with a contractor too, by the way, I spent 10 years with Boeing after I left NASA. I mean, they'll find a way to spend it for you, you know. So we don't want them spending it up front, loading up on manpower, and we don't want NASA doing that either, or any other government agency doing it too fast. Break up your program such that you've got the small objectives for the next 5 missions or some number like that, and build your road that way. It's so easy to say, let's go back to the moon, and Harrison, I'm sorry about this, but go back to the moon and also learn how to go to Mars. That's a great first step. What we need to do is break it down about 2 levels below that so that we can get to what we need to do next week, next month.
Oh, I wouldn't argue with that. It's just that you have to keep the ultimate goal in mind, and so you keep your designs going in the right direction. And if you start to slip milestones, you're going to start to slip political support. So that's why you have to have the management reserve in order to stay on schedule.
Let me add a personal Apollo story. I was a co-op here during Apollo at the Manned Spacecraft Center, and was the last person hired in Apollo. And guess what? When it ended, I was the first person fired. So I was actually riffed from Manned Spacecraft Center after I'd been here 6 months full time. That taught me an important lesson, which you all are touching on, Jack, you especially. Apollo is a great way to get something started, but how do you make it sustainable? How do you build it sustainable? And a lot's been done about that, but that's...
Mark, I think there's a lesson in what happened to the Bush 41 initiative, in that there was unfortunately a decision or some kind of decision to give out a total cost. And what we have to do politically is to look at this as a sustaining program of a certain budget level per year and learn to live with that, or per budget cycle. If you put a total cost on it, the opposition is always going to be able to knock you down. But space is such an important part of our future. Sustaining ourselves there is absolutely, I think, critical, geopolitically as well as for a whole bunch of other reasons. And that, so you need to think of it in terms of an annual level of expenditure that matches the need and the importance of being in space and being not only there, but competitive, if not dominant.
Well, coincidentally, I was the AA at that time in that Bush administration.
What's that?
I was the AA at that time and involved in that too, having been riffed from JSC early on and then come back. One thing I would add to that, and Chet got into it, is why do we do this? The why has to be compelling, it has to be real, and it has to shape what we do, and it has to be politically sustainable.
And I would have added to that, what we need to do is have the work defined for the next 3 years of the close-in work tied into a long-term strategy, and have the budget that we're using, obviously providing support to that work.
Okay, up here in the back, please, sir.
Yep, you've kind of hit on crew selection, but in the broader sense, you've really talked about the difficulties that you encountered and overcame multiple times. So what is it about the crew that was there that help position them or set the conditions for their success when these obstacles were thrown in their way and they overcame them? And how do we make sure that, because we kind of made reference to the scarf and goggles versus the scientist, but that if we move more towards the scientist, then that presumes that we've got the technology fixed in such a way that we're never going to encounter a difficulty that has to be overcome. So how do we maintain that entrepreneurial, adventuresome explorer spirit and not lose that so that we make sure that we've got the right people when the problem does occur? Because we have to assume there will be a problem, otherwise that would seem to be foolish given the history.
Of course, I always felt that everybody should learn to fly T-38s and helicopters, so that you have a very diverse, broad-based crew training. Even, but most importantly, I think, is that you look at the tasks, the types of jobs that have to be done, and you select crew that have the professional experience base in order to perform in those task areas. And some will be test pilots are absolutely perfect, and you want to have them. And I think that's why Apollo was successful, is because we had that kind. It was a test program. It really was. Even though we flew quite 7 missions to the moon, 8 missions to the moon, 9 missions. I'll get it right. It's still, that's not a lot of missions, and every flight had its test aspects to it, in the sense that you were trying to make sure that you were learning from those missions. So I think the test pilot selection was absolutely correct. Not everybody was as good as everybody else, but when you look at Neil Armstrong as the first person to fly a Apollo rocket to the surface of the moon, I can't think of a better choice. I really can't. And even though I was hoping, like everybody else, that I'd be on that crew, Neil was absolutely perfect. But that can be said almost by every mission, that you had the kind of people on those missions that you needed to have for that function. Now, as you look at having more and more people involved, yes, you look at the different expertise. You look at physicians, you look at geologists, you look at biologists, whatever the mission, and the crew selection for a mission should be tailored to what the objectives of the mission are. It should not, in Apollo, there was a great deal of who was in the pipeline and who was cycling ahead. But I think now, in the future, you have to look at crew selection as what are going to be the necessary tasks of that mission, and select your crew accordingly. By the way, I just as an aside, I would not use genomic testing for crew selection. I think you get yourself into all sorts of problems, and you may lose a chance to have people who are really can be important to the future. But having, knowing that, having that information after selection, I think is probably very important. But to put that into the mix on crew selection, I think would be a mistake. Just personal opinion.
Back up here.
Yes, I think we've heard a lot of very important lessons from Apollo, and we started down the road to the next, generation of space flight in Constellation, but we didn't succeed. And a lot of you up there were very much involved. Rick and I and others pinged you to get advice on how to get success with Constellation. And we had outstanding leadership. We had Mike Griffith and Jeff Hanley, and top of the field at the time, but we couldn't make it because of lack of management reserve. You talked about, Jack, and the lack of political support. So how do we get a 10-year strategic plan, bipartisan approved program that we could sustain despite administrative whims that happen with any type of national agenda?
Political support was there.
Yes.
No, that Congress was there. What wasn't there was support in the OMB. And the White House, the Oval Office, was not paying attention to what OMB was doing, as near as I can tell. Mm-hmm. And Mike made the estimate that by the end of the program, OMB had cut $11 billion out of what had previously been said was necessary to stay on schedule. It had some management reserve in it, not 100%, but I think about 30%, something like that. And that's probably adequate today. But OMB was not on board. And so the momentum never developed. Schedules were being slipped. The momentum has never developed to survive a change in administration.
That's right, but we hadn't started actually building hardware in time. You have to get the hardware committed early on, like Chester said. You had to build the hardware early, test it, already commit that road very early if you're going to have a sustainability. And we didn't get that because, a lot of it was we were doing things that had never been done.
And I think that we need to define the right role for the commercial. We hadn't talked about that yet, but that's a big, big deal. We're going to need an awful lot of propellant, so NASA and somebody needs to figure out a master plan. I don't think we have a master plan. I've not seen one, but I'm not up to date in the last 10 years or more, so it might be out there. But I'd like to see a master plan that says, hey, here's what we need to do. We want an objective of going to the Mars, assuming that that's it. And I don't know if that is the right one or not, but I would support it if somebody said it. I do know it's easy to say and hard to do. I mean, it's a lot harder to do than the moon mission in a lot of ways in terms of the resources required to do it. Technology-wise, I think we could work those issues out in the design of new hardware to do that. We're not going to get new propulsion, except for small thrusters that, like resisto jets and stuff like that would be applicable. We don't want to get into a nuclear program or something else that's brand new technology for us again. I think that, that would be nice to have, but I think it would be hard to get. But we need to figure out what we need to do in the short term to support the long term and get that out there, and then maybe get support for the total job. So we need a big picture, I think, and get that ironed out, show how long we stay at the moon, whether we're going to do a lunar rendezvous or do an Earth rendezvous, what inclination we're going to be in. I mean, a lot of those things just need to get settled and agreed to and stick with if we can. And then I think we can develop short-term things that would satisfy the budget and to give people an opportunity to support that budget because they know what the money is going to be used for. That's all.
Okay, George has given us 5 more minutes here, so back here in the back.
Yes, probably short question and a short answer, but I want to know what your perspective is. What do you see from looking from the Apollo program towards the international program we have today? Adding international adds complexity, a lot of rewards, a lot of opportunity, but what do you see when you look towards the current and potentially future international programs?
Well, let me say, one of the first international programs was something that, if related to Apollo, was Gene Shoemaker's insistence that the sample analysis be internationalized. I think it was a very important decision. That was done well before any Apollo launches were done. But it was not in the critical path of success. I just think that somebody has to be in charge, and then you have all sorts of opportunities for cooperation, for participation in the program. But somebody, some nation or agency has to be in charge to make decisions. If you're going to have a timely movement into the program, I'm not saying that you can't be successful with a multi-nation decision-making process, but the time it's going to take and maintaining political support over that kind of time is very difficult. So if you want to lay out a schedule and you want to make that schedule and keep political support, I think somebody has to be in charge. But then I think any country that's interested can participate, but not in the critical path. And right now, Orion is off schedule because of the service module is off schedule, and the service module is not under the control of NASA. So that's just one more illustration. It doesn't mean there can't be extraordinarily important and exciting international participation, but somebody has to run it. That's just my opinion.
Question back here.
Yeah, so my world is actually to work with the commercial crew companies right now. We're building crew modules that are going to carry NASA astronauts to the ISS. We have a set of requirements, and we've actually trimmed them down considerably, so they're not overly prescriptive. That causes a lot of us not to sleep well at night because of the very broad interpretation of those requirements and the extremely different approach between the two main vendors. They don't know what you're telling us. We haven't told them. My question is, have commercial entities reached out to the Apollo community to find out directly what these lessons learned have been to apply to their new efforts at spacecraft design?
Not to me.
And in a way, what would you tell them?
I'll be biased a little bit because I worked with the Boeing company some in the initial goings of their orbital vehicle, and they did reach out to a lot of NASA people helping do that. They're not doing it the same way. They're doing it in a way that makes sense for a short mission, not for a long mission, and that's especially associated with the crew support systems that are on board. But it's supposed to be able to take care of them for ascent and entry, and they did reach out, and I think they got both of them. I don't know about SpaceX. I don't have any insight at all in there, but based on their successes so far, I suspect they're pretty close to the same measure of making that happen. So I think they have, and I know that the NASA people in KSC and JSC has been working with SpaceX as well as with Boeing. So that has happened, I know.
If I could partly answer, Mike, Blue Abyss is a commercial company, and we're working with Walter Koeniger, who was one of the PIs. Blue Abyss is working with Walter Koeniger, who was one of the PIs that helped Jack walk on the moon. He's providing us with valuable knowledge for us to understand how we can prepare, do the science, and enable planetary exploration in the future as a commercial company supporting commercial human spaceflight.
Oh, okay, somebody can tell me when I got to quit. Go ahead.
Just quickly, I want to follow up on the service module for ESA, right? So I'm a test conductor for the service module for commercial crew for Boeing. We're testing side by side by ESA, right? I'm from Italy, so I'm European as well. But we are not allowed to talk with them, right? We're using the same control room. And they're using as a propulsion system the OMS, the orbital modeling system of the shuttle, and RCS from the Apollo. And they're having problem with, probably you're aware of. And I'm sure they probably have not been helped with data. And my team, I was RE for the RCS for the shuttle, and the rest of my team are all very expert with the OMS that they are using, and we cannot share information with them. I think there's a big, we could have definitely help them to be more successful. So that delay is probably caused also by lack of cooperation.
Wow. That's not good. That's too bad.
I'll tell you what we'll do. I guess we're between you and lunch, right? Is that right? Yeah. How about one more question? One more. Or comment, or you're hungry. Oh, got one here.
You asked for it. As anyone can hear, I have an international background, but I work as a contractor for NASA. I cannot emphasize more what Jack Schmitt said before, that there must be one leading the future effort. And being a European, it should be United States of America and NASA. I was brought up, I was 16 years of age when we landed on the moon. I cannot imagine anyone else leading this effort. And the second thing is, I'm totally convinced that if United States shows even more leadership in this area, the Europeans and all the other nations will just follow, because they will have an excuse to convince their political oppositions to do this, because otherwise it will be done anyway. And finally, I have one question to all of my American friends. I don't understand why we can't, you may disagree with the current administration, I'm not going into that. I've done it with my neighbors, I won't do it again. But let me put it this way, I simply don't understand why it's not easy to convince the current administration with the current goals to do an even bigger space program. I simply don't understand why it hasn't been convincible to the current administration. So maybe there's a lack of communication between the top NASA officials and the administration, or there's resistance, I don't know. But it just seems to fit so much into the slogan of making the country great again, that you could actually utilize that to expand the space program. But I'm just asking out of naivety and curiosity.
Well, insiders in NASA, I attended the previous session. Insiders at NASA understand so much more than there is outside. I've been retired a while, so when I sat in here and I heard the surgeon talking about 80% of your Alzheimer or your cardiovascular is exercise and what you eat and your stress, only 20% is genetic. And so it's common knowledge here. But somehow we've always suffered with NASA being able to boil up and out all that information that we're gathering. And it's almost painful to look at why you can't convince somebody because they don't know what you're doing. Sorry.
All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And I hope you have a very pleasant remainder of this event. Thank you very much.